Close your eyes and let the world around you grow quiet. Whatever you are doing today, wherever your mind has been, let it soften now. You don't need to hold on to any of it. Set it down gently, like a book you've finished reading for the evening. Tonight we are going somewhere ancient, somewhere golden and still, where the wind moves in long, slow ribbons across the sand, and the stars above are so thick and bright they seem to rest on the horizon, like a second desert made of light. We are going to Egypt, to a plateau above the Nile, where 3 great pyramids stand in the dark, and where one monument older than memory itself sits and watches the east, waiting for the sun. Let your body sink into where you are lying. Feel the weight of your limb. Feel your shoulders release, your hands uncurl. There's nothing you need to do tonight except drift. And tonight, we drift through one of the greatest mysteries the ancient world ever left behind. The Great Sphinx of Giza. A face in the desert, a question carved in stone. Let's begin. Imagine the Giza Plateau, just before sunrise. The sky is not yet blue. It is that deep, particular shade of indigo that exists only in the hour before morning truly begins. The stars are still visible overhead, slowly fading at the edges, where the horizon is beginning to glow. There is almost no sound. A dry, warm wind moves across the plateau, lifting small spirals of sand that twist and vanish like ghosts. And there, carved directly from the living rock of the earth itself, the Great Sphinx waits. It has been waiting like this for a very long time. Its enormous body stretches out across the stone, the long, powerful form of a lion, lying at rest, forepaws extended forward, chest broad and low to the ground. And rising from that body, incongruous and serene, is a human head, a face, looking east, always looking east, toward the place where the sun will rise, as it has risen every single morning since the monument was made. The face is damaged now. The nose is gone, lost to time and to hands we cannot fully account for. The surface is worn and cracked, repaired in patches with different stones across different centuries, so that the monument carries the marks of every generation that has tried to preserve it. But even in this wounded state, there is something powerful in the expression, something still, something watching. The Great Sphinx is one of the most recognized monuments on Earth. It has appeared in paintings, in books, in films, in dreams. Nearly every person alive has seen an image of it. And yet, despite its fame, despite the armies of archaeologists and geologists and historians who have studied it for centuries, it keeps a secret at its center that has never been fully unlocked. How old is it really? That question seems simple. Monuments are built at a specific time, by specific people, for specific reasons. There should be an answer. And there is an answer. An official answer. A mainstream answer. Backed by decades of scholarly consensus. Most Egyptologists will tell you the Sphinx was built around 4,500 years ago, during the reign of a pharaoh named Khafre, during the height of the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt. But not everyone agrees. Some researchers, including a small but persistent group of geologists, look at the Sphinx and see something different. They look at the patterns worn into the stone, at the deep channels and rounded surfaces of the enclosure walls, and they argue that the damage they see could not have been made in the dry desert climate that Egypt has known for the last 5,000 years. They see instead the marks of rain. Heavy, repeated, ancient rain. Rain that fell on Egypt, not during the dynastic era, but long before it. Perhaps 10,000 years ago, perhaps more. If they are right, the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. It is perhaps 9,000 years old, or 12,000. A monument from before history, in any form we recognize. A remnant of people whose names we do not know, whose language has never been written down, who lived and built and disappeared before the very concept of Egypt existed. That possibility, that the most famous monument in the ancient world might itself be ancient by ancient standards, is one of the great unresolved debates in archaeology. And tonight, very slowly, very gently, we are going to walk through all of it. Let your breathing slow now. In through the nose and out, in and out. The desert is quiet. The stars are still fading. And the Sphinx is watching the east, the same as it always does. Let's begin at the beginning. To understand the mystery of the Sphinx, it helps to understand the world it was supposedly born into. Ancient Egypt. Even saying the words feels like opening a door into another kind of time. Not just a distant era, but a genuinely different way of being human in the world. Picture the Nile River, long and slow and extraordinary, cutting through one of the driest landscapes on Earth. On either side of the river, a thin band of rich green land, fields of emmer wheat and barley, date palms, papyrus reeds swaying at the water's edge. And beyond that green ribbon, almost immediately, the desert, pale and vast and absolutely indifferent. The Egyptians called these two worlds the Black Land and the Red Land. The Black Land was life, the Red Land was death, and the boundary between them was the Nile itself, generous and unpredictable and sacred. Egyptian civilization organized itself around this geography with remarkable precision and creativity. The river flooded every year, depositing fresh silt onto the fields, making the land fertile almost without effort. The Egyptians learned to predict the floods, to manage the water, to store grain against the years when the floods came too low or too high. They built an entire administrative system, one of the earliest bureaucracies in history, to manage the distribution of water and food across a long, narrow country that stretched for hundreds of miles. And at the top of this system sat the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was not simply a king in the way we might think of kings today. The Pharaoh was understood to be a living god, or at least the representative of the divine on earth, a figure standing between the human world and the world of the gods, maintaining the cosmic balance that kept the Nile flooding and the sun rising. This concept had a name, Ma'at. It meant truth, order, balance, justice, all of those things at once. The Pharaoh's primary function was to maintain Ma'at, to keep everything in its proper place, to prevent chaos. Monuments were part of this project. When we think of Egyptian monuments today, we tend to think of them as expressions of ego, kings building giant things to show how powerful they were. And that is certainly part of it. But the monuments were also theological statements. They were ways of anchoring divine power in the physical world. A pyramid rising from the desert was not just a tomb. It was a machine for transformation, a symbolic mountain connecting earth to sky, a statement that the order of the universe was maintained here, at this place, by this king. The Old Kingdom, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, was the period when this monumental impulse reached its first and perhaps greatest peak. This is when the Great Pyramids at Giza were built. The Pyramid of Khufu, the largest stone structure ever built by human hands. The Pyramid of Khafre, slightly smaller, but sitting on higher ground, and so appearing almost as tall. And the Pyramid of Menkaure, smaller still, but exquisitely finished. These three pyramids, arranged in a slightly offset diagonal across the plateau, remain among the most impressive architectural achievements in history. And beside them, carved from the bedrock itself, the Sphinx. In this context, the context of a civilization obsessed with divine order, with the alignment of monuments to the sky, with the transformation of raw stone into expressions of eternal power, the Sphinx fits naturally. A guardian, a watcher, a figure at once human and animal, divine and physical, looking east toward the rising sun, the source of life. This is the world that mainstream Egyptologists say produced the Sphinx, a sophisticated, organized, powerful civilization at the height of its creative and spiritual ambition. But here is a thought that carries you toward sleep. even in the context of a civilization that left behind thousands of inscriptions, hundreds of texts, records carved onto temple walls, and papyrus scrolls and limestone blocks. Even in a culture that documented so much, the Sphinx itself was left in silence. No clear inscription from the Old Kingdom says who built it or why. That silence is where the mystery lives. Let that thought rest in you. Don't solve it, just hold it, gently. The way you hold something precious and mysterious in a half-dream. The desert, the river, the stone. Before we go deeper into the mystery, let us spend some time simply being with the monument itself. The Great Sphinx of Giza is, in purely physical terms, one of the largest sculptures ever made. It measures approximately 240 feet from the front of its extended forepaws to the back of its haunches, nearly the length of an American football field. It stands about 66 feet tall at its highest point, which is the top of its headdress. The body is roughly 20 feet wide at its widest point. These are large numbers, but numbers rarely capture the experience of standing near something massive. People who have visited the Sphinx often describe an unexpected emotional response. Not awe exactly, though awe is certainly present, something more personal, something almost like recognition, as if the monument is already familiar, in a way that goes beyond having seen photographs of it. It is the kind of feeling that belongs to dreams. What makes the Sphinx physically unique among great monuments is how it was made. The pyramids were built. Enormous quarried blocks were shaped, transported, and stacked, millions of them, over years and decades, into their final forms. The construction of the pyramids was, among other things, a feat of logistics and organization almost beyond modern comprehension. Hundreds of thousands of workers, coordinated across years, moving and placing stone with extraordinary precision. The Sphinx was not built, it was carved. The Giza Plateau is made of limestone, ancient seafloor rock, laid down over millions of years, when this part of northeastern Africa was covered by a shallow sea. Over time the sea retreated, the land rose, and what was left was a vast, relatively flat plateau of rock. When the ancient builders came to this plateau, they found a natural outcropping of limestone, perhaps a low hill or ridge, and they cut into it, carving away the surrounding rock to reveal the form within. This means the Sphinx is not separate from the earth. It is part of the earth. The same rock that forms the floor of the plateau is the rock that forms the body of the Sphinx. They share a skeleton of stone. Around the body, as the carvers cut away the surrounding limestone, a large pit was created, called the Sphinx enclosure. This enclosure is not usually visible in photographs taken at ground level, because the floor of the enclosure has been filled in, and the walls are partly buried. But from above or from the right angle, you can see that the Sphinx sits in a kind of sunken courtyard, cut into the plateau, with rock walls rising on either side. Those walls are crucial to the age debate, as we will discover later, because it is on those walls, the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, that the most contested evidence of the Sphinx's true age can be seen. Now let's look at the monument itself more slowly. The body is a lion, or at least it is lion-like. A large animal lying at rest, forepaws extended forward, with the relaxed but powerful posture of a cat in repose. The proportions are somewhat unusual for a real lion, elongated and flat, in a way that may reflect the constraints of the original rock formation, rather than pure artistic choice. Between the forepaws, there is a small shrine-like space where the dream Stele was later placed. We'll come to that Stele in a few chapters. The head wears what is called a Thutmose headdress, a striped cloth headpiece worn by pharaohs, falling in two large flaps in front of the shoulders and gathered into a tail at the back. The face itself is broad and formal, with large features, wide eyes, a straight brow, a strong jaw. The nose, famously, is missing. It was not removed in a single dramatic act, but worn away over centuries, possibly helped along by deliberate damage at some point during the medieval period. The lips are full. The expression is impossible to read with certainty. Solemn, perhaps, patient, or simply neutral in the way that stone is neutral, reflecting back whatever emotion the observer brings to it. There is also a beard, or rather the remains of a beard, a ceremonial false beard, the kind worn by pharaohs in formal depictions. Fragments of this beard survive and are held in the collections of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and the British Museum in London. Whether the beard was an original feature or a later addition is debated. Take a moment with all of this. A lion's body, stretching long and low across the plateau. A human face, looking east. A headdress of a king. A missing nose. A beard in a museum across the sea. This is the Sphinx, not a perfect, unified object, but a layered thing, added to and subtracted from, over thousands of years of human attention. Breathe in slowly. Let the image settle. Now let us sit with the mainstream view, carefully, fairly, with respect for the serious scholarship that supports it. The most widely accepted answer to the question of who built the Sphinx is Pharaoh Khafre, who ruled Egypt during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, approximately 2558 to 2532 BCE. That makes the Sphinx approximately 4,500 years old. This answer is not a guess. It is built on a convergence of multiple lines of evidence, and it is endorsed by the majority of Egyptologists, the scholars who specialize in the study of ancient Egypt. Let's walk through the reasoning. The Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau, in the context of a carefully organized architectural complex. The 3 major pyramids at Giza are associated with 3 pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, in that order from north to south. The Sphinx is located in the area associated with the second of these pharaohs, Khafre. It sits to the east of Khafre's pyramid, and its temple, a large mortuary structure immediately in front of the Sphinx, aligns closely with Khafre's Valley Temple, which is the temple at the base of the long causeway, connecting Khafre's pyramid to the river. That alignment is significant. The 2 temples share architectural characteristics. They are built of large limestone blocks, faced with granite, using the same style and materials. The causeways and temples at Giza formed a unified ceremonial landscape, and the Sphinx's temple appears to have been designed to be part of Khafre's funerary complex. This architectural coherence is one of the strongest arguments for the traditional dating. There is also the matter of the face. Comparisons between the Sphinx's face and surviving statues identified as Khafre, including a famous diorite statue now held in the Cairo Museum, one of the finest examples of Old Kingdom royal sculpture, suggest some facial resemblance. The broad, formal features, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes. This is contested. Facial reconstruction is a difficult science, and the Sphinx's face has been significantly damaged and perhaps altered over the millennia. But to many observers, the resemblance is real enough to be meaningful. There is one more piece of evidence that is sometimes cited, though it is slightly complicated. An ancient stele called the Inventory Stele, discovered in the 19th century, mentions Khufu, Khafre's father, encountering the Sphinx as if it already existed during Khufu's reign. If true, this would mean the Sphinx predates even Khafre, possibly dating to Khufu's time or earlier. However, most Egyptologists believe the Inventory Stele was written much later than the events it describes and may not be a reliable historical document, so it tends to be set aside rather than incorporated into the mainstream argument. The overall picture is this. The Sphinx is architecturally integrated into the complex of a king named Khafre. It may bear that king's face, and it is surrounded by structures from his reign. In the absence of contradicting evidence strong enough to overturn that context, Khafre remains the consensus answer. This is a reasonable conclusion. It is not arbitrary. It reflects careful, systematic scholarship over more than a century. And yet the question does not go away. Let that word, yet, drift through your mind, gently, like a leaf on water, not urgently, just floating there. The traditional answer is the most likely answer. But the story does not end there. Here is the thing that makes the Sphinx unlike almost every other major monument in ancient Egypt. There is no direct inscription. Ancient Egypt was a civilization that loved to inscribe things. Temple walls were covered in hieroglyphs, recording the deeds of kings. Stele were carved with royal proclamations and religious dedications. Tombs were filled with texts, describing the life and accomplishments of their occupants. We know the names of hundreds of pharaohs. We know the names of their architects. We know the names of officials who supervised construction projects. We have letters between workers. We have administrative documents listing rations for laborers. We have detailed records of quarrying expeditions and mining operations from thousands of years before the Common Era. Egypt, in other words, left a paper trail, or rather a stone trail, of extraordinary depth and detail. But for the Sphinx, one of the most enormous and commanding monuments on the entire plateau, there is no Old Kingdom inscription that clearly says, "This monument was built by Khafre," or "built for Khafre," or "built in the reign of Khafre." None. This is surprising when you think about it. Not devastating to the mainstream view. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as scholars rightly point out. There are plenty of monuments from ancient Egypt whose builders are uncertain or unknown. And the context of the Sphinx, within Khafre's complex, is still powerful evidence. But the silence is notable. Later Egyptians, writing about the Sphinx during the New Kingdom, hundreds of years after it was supposedly built, treated it as something extraordinarily ancient. When Pharaoh Thutmose IV placed his famous stele between the paws of the Sphinx around 1400 BCE, the text of that stele refers to the monument as if it belongs to a deep, almost mythological past. There is a reverence in it that goes beyond the typical reverence Egyptians showed for their own monuments. It reads almost as if Thutmose considered the Sphinx to belong to an age before living memory. That New Kingdom sense of the Sphinx's antiquity is interesting. It does not prove the Sphinx is older than Khafre's reign. People often exaggerate the age of impressive old things, and Khafre's time would already have been ancient history from Thutmose's perspective, roughly 1100 years earlier. But it does suggest that even within the continuous tradition of Egyptian civilization, the Sphinx occupied a category of peculiar, deep antiquity. The silence of the stone, the reverence of later centuries, and the absence of a clear founding inscription create a space in the historical record, a gap. And into that gap, over the generations, many ideas have flowed. Let the gap exist in your mind without trying to fill it. That is what the best thinking about mystery does. It rests inside the unknown without needing to rush toward an answer. Rest there now. The Sphinx is not going anywhere. There is another dimension of the Sphinx's story that is rarely fully appreciated. For much of its existence, the Sphinx was not visible. The desert has a way of consuming things. The wind that blows across the Sahara carries enormous quantities of fine sand, and that sand settles wherever it can. Against any vertical surface, a wall, a cliff, a carved monument, the sand accumulates. Year by year, century by century, what was visible slowly disappears beneath a rising tide of pale dust. The Great Sphinx has been buried, partially or almost completely, multiple times across its history. For long stretches of ancient, medieval, and early modern history, travelers arriving at Giza may have seen only the monument's head rising above the surface of the surrounding sand, like a disembodied face, emerging from a pale sea. The body, the lion's body, the forepaws, the elaborate enclosure walls, were hidden, invisible, gone. The first recorded excavation of the Sphinx was ordered by Pharaoh Thutmose IV, around 1400 BCE, the same pharaoh of the dream Stele we will discuss shortly. He had the sand cleared from around the monument, at least partially. But the desert was patient. It refilled. Later rulers cleared it again. The cycle repeated across different centuries, different dynasties, different empires. By the time Greek and Roman visitors came to Giza, during the classical period, when Egypt had already been absorbed into the Hellenistic and then the Roman world, the Sphinx was largely buried again. Roman-era visitors left graffiti near the monument's head, suggesting that the body was buried to approximately the neck at that time. The Sphinx, to a Roman traveler, would have looked like a colossal head simply resting on the sand, which must have seemed extraordinary and eerie. During the medieval period, Arabic writers described the monument as a strange and powerful presence. Some called it the Balhib, or the Father of Terror. The name we now use, Sphinx, comes from the Greek tradition, likely connected to the Greek mythological creature that asked riddles and killed those who could not answer them. But the original Egyptian name for the monument is debated. Some scholars believe it was called Horem Akhet, or Horus, on the horizon, a name that connects it to the sun and to the god of the sky. Others see an older name, Shesep Ankh, meaning living image. The monument's buried state, for so much of its history, has important implications for the age debate. The erosion evidence that some researchers find so compelling, the deep channels and rounded weathering on the enclosure walls, would have been covered by sand for much of history. The sand, in an odd way, may have preserved the erosion. When it was cleared in modern times, the patterns in the stone were exposed, fresh to scientific scrutiny. And those patterns tell a story, a contested story, a story we are moving toward. But for now, simply imagine the Sphinx as it spent most of its existence, buried, sleeping beneath the desert, its face alone above the surface, watching the sky, waiting for someone to come and ask the right question. There is something restful in that image, something deeply quiet. A face above the sand, stars above the face. Breathe. Let us tell the story of the dream Stele. It is one of the most evocative stories connected to the Sphinx, and it rewards slow telling. The time is approximately 1400 BCE. Egypt is in the height of the New Kingdom, a different era entirely from the Old Kingdom that produced the pyramids. The New Kingdom is a period of imperial expansion, of warrior pharaohs, of vast wealth pouring into Egypt from conquered territories in Syria, Palestine, and Nubia. Egypt is at its most powerful and most cosmopolitan. A young man named Thutmose, a prince, one of the sons of Pharaoh Amenhotep II, comes to Giza to hunt in the desert. Hunting was a royal pastime, a demonstration of physical prowess and divine favor. The plateau around the pyramids was not the tourist destination it is today. It was open desert, studded with ancient monuments full of game. Thutmose hunts until he is exhausted. And in the heat of the afternoon, he rests in the shadow of a great stone head that rises from the sand, the head of the Great Sphinx, which is buried to the neck at this time, perhaps deeper. And he falls asleep. In his sleep, he dreams. In the dream, the Sphinx speaks to him. It speaks in the first person, identifying itself as the sun god, Ra-Horakti, Ra, who is Horus of the horizon. And it tells the young prince that it is suffering. The sand is heavy upon its body. It has been abandoned. It calls out for someone to clear away the desert that has buried it. And in the dream, it makes a promise. If the young prince, this Thutmose, this particular son, among many sons of the current pharaoh, will clear away the sand and restore the monument to its former dignity, then the god within the stone will reward him. He will become pharaoh. He will wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He will rule. Thutmose IV did become pharaoh. He was not the eldest son, not the most obvious heir, which is perhaps why the story of divine selection was so politically useful. He ordered the Sphinx excavated. The sand was cleared, at least partially, and between the great stone forepaws of the monument, he placed a large granite stele to record the dream and his fulfillment of its promise. That stele is still there today. You can visit it. You can stand between the paws of the Sphinx and look at the pinkish granite slab, carved with hieroglyphs that preserve, after 3,500 years, the dream of a young prince in the afternoon desert. The stele is a remarkable document for several reasons. It confirms that by 1400 BCE, the Sphinx was already ancient enough to be treated as divine and mysterious. Not a monument of living memory, but a relic of a deeper past. The tone of the dream text suggests that the Sphinx was already somewhat neglected by that point, already half forgotten, even by the civilization that is supposed to have built it. The stele also refers to a royal cartouche, an oval frame containing a pharaoh's name that appears to be damaged at a crucial place. In the text, some scholars have tried to read this cartouche as containing the name Khafre, which would be evidence linking Khafre to the Sphinx. But the damage is significant enough that the reading is disputed, and different scholars read it differently. So the dream stele offers us a window, a beautifully personal, narratively rich window, into the ancient relationship between humans and this monument. But like so much of the Sphinx's evidence, it illuminates without fully resolving. A prince, a dream, a promise, and a stone face rising from the sand, speaking of forgotten times. What a strange and beautiful thing to have preserved. Let that story drift gently through you. A boy asleep beneath a stone face, a god's voice in the dream, the sun moving slowly across the sky, above them both. Sleep is not so different from that, perhaps. A kind of visitation, a quiet place where something larger than ordinary life sometimes speaks. Now we enter the heart of the technical debate. I'll guide you through it gently, because the details are genuinely interesting. But we'll move slowly, and there is no need to hold every piece of information. Let it wash over you like water. When researchers and visitors look at the body of the Sphinx and at the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the pit carved around the monument, they observe something that has generated enormous debate among geologists and Egyptologists since the early 1990s. The stone is eroded. That is expected. It is very old stone, and erosion is natural. What is less expected, according to some researchers, is the pattern of the erosion. On the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the vertical rock faces surrounding the monument on three sides, the erosion takes a distinctive form. The surface is rounded and undulating, cut into deep vertical channels and billowing shapes that follow the joints and soft zones in the limestone. The channels are rounded at their edges, smoothed in a particular way, and they run predominantly vertically. When geologist Robert Schaff first examined these patterns in the early 1990s, something struck him. He had spent years studying erosion patterns on rock in different geological contexts. And the patterns on the Sphinx enclosure, he argued, did not look like wind erosion. Wind erosion in desert environments tends to cut horizontally, following the direction of the prevailing wind, creating horizontal striations and undercuts. The erosion on the Sphinx enclosure runs vertically, cutting down the walls, in patterns that Schaff and his colleagues associated with precipitation, with water falling from above and running down the surface, specifically, rain. Now, this was a serious claim, because it immediately ran into a climate problem. Egypt has been dry, genuinely, deeply dry, for roughly the last 5,000 years. The Sahara Desert, which was not always a desert, underwent a dramatic drying process beginning around 5000 to 3500 BCE. Before that drying, much of what is now desert was savanna or semi-arid grassland, with more reliable rainfall. But after the drying, the region became the hyper-arid landscape we know today. If the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure was caused by rain, significant sustained rain, then that rain must have fallen before Egypt dried out, before roughly 5000 BCE, possibly before 7000, or even 10,000 BCE. And a monument that had to predate 5000 BCE in order to have been rained upon substantially would have to be far older than Khafre's reign in 2500 BCE. Let that logic settle in your mind. It is a geological argument, not a mystical one, not a claim about lost civilizations or ancient secrets, at least not at its core. It begins simply with, look at this rock. What kind of weather made these marks? The stone itself becomes a kind of archive, a memory in mineral. Whether the archive says what Schoch thinks it says is the subject of intense disagreement. But the question itself is serious. In the morning, if you remember only one thing from this chapter, let it be this. The mystery of the Sphinx is not just about history. It is also about geology, about the way stone remembers weather that happened long before any human being was watching. Close your eyes a little more. Let the stone speak in its slow, quiet language. Building on the erosion evidence, let us walk through the alternative theory in its fullest, most thoughtful form. The central figure in this debate is Robert Schoch, a geologist and associate professor at Boston University, who first published his analysis of the Sphinx enclosure erosion in the early 1990s. Schoch did not approach the Sphinx as a fringe theorist. He came to it through conventional academic geology, using the same methods he used to analyze erosion at other sites. And what he saw, he reported as a geologist. The erosion looked to him like the product of prolonged heavy rainfall. Working with others, including writer and researcher John Anthony West, who had first drawn attention to this possibility based on the work of earlier scholars, Schoch presented his findings at a geological conference in 1992. The response from geologists was not dismissive. Many found the observations interesting, worthy of further discussion. The response from Egyptologists was considerably more skeptical. Here is the core of the rainfall theory, laid out step by step. First, the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure walls is precipitation-induced, not wind-induced. The pattern, the depth, and the character of the weathering are more consistent with long-term exposure to rainfall than with desert wind erosion. Second, for significant rainfall to have produced this erosion, the rain must have fallen over a substantial period, not just a few unusually wet seasons, but centuries or millennia of wetter climate. Third, the last time the Giza Plateau received this kind of sustained rainfall was during the African humid period, the so-called Green Sahara period, which ended roughly between 5000 and 3500 BCE, depending on the region. Fourth, therefore, the Sphinx enclosure must have been carved before the end of the African humid period. The surface now showing rainfall erosion had to have been exposed to rain while the rain was still falling. If the enclosure was carved in 2500 BC, after the drying of the Sahara, it would not show this kind of rain erosion because there was essentially no rain to cause it. Fifth, this places the carving of the Sphinx enclosure before roughly 5000 BCE, and possibly as early as 10,000 to 7,000 BCE, the height of the wetter Holocene period in North Africa. If the Sphinx was carved during this earlier period, then it predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. It predates hieroglyphic writing. It predates the first pharaohs. It was made by people who lived and worked on the Giza Plateau in a much wetter, greener landscape, perhaps under palm trees, beside rivers or lakes, in a world entirely unlike the desert plateau we know today. This is a profound and humbling idea. It suggests that someone, in the distant prehistoric past, possessed the vision, the organizational capacity, the engineering knowledge, and the cultural motivation to carve a monument of this size and this complexity. Not a primitive camp or a simple stone tool, but a massive, intentional, artistically conceived sculpture, hundreds of feet long. We do not know who these people were. We do not have their language, their myths, their names. If they built other things, those things may be buried, or eroded beyond recognition, or located in places not yet excavated. The Sphinx, in this scenario, is the survivor, the one thing that endured from a lost chapter of human experience. Breathe that in slowly. A world before recorded history. People standing on a plateau, above a wetter Nile, looking at a ridge of limestone and deciding to make something from it. Something that looked east, something that watched. We don't know their names. We don't know what they believed. But they left this thing, and it is still here. It would not be fair or accurate to present only one side of this debate. The mainstream scholarly view deserves its full and honest hearing because it is based on real evidence and real expertise, and it is held by serious, thoughtful people. When Robert Schoch presented his rainfall erosion hypothesis in 1992, Egyptologists pushed back. Some pushed back dismissively, which is worth noting because dismissiveness is rarely good scholarship. But many pushed back substantively, with genuine counterarguments that deserve consideration. The first and most important counterargument concerns the limestone itself. The Giza Plateau is not made of uniform limestone. It is made of several distinct layers, each deposited in different geological eras, each with different mineral compositions and different physical properties. Some layers are harder and more resistant to erosion. Others are softer, more porous, and more vulnerable to any kind of weathering. Wind, water, salt, chemical processes. The Sphinx and its enclosure cut through multiple layers of this variability. Mainstream geologists who examined the Sphinx argued that what Schoch interpreted as rainfall erosion could be explained by the differential weathering of these soft limestone layers, combined with salt damage, groundwater effects, and the particular vulnerability of the stone to any moisture, including the rare but non-zero rainfall that does occasionally fall on Giza even today. Poor quality, crumbly limestone exposed at the surface does not need centuries of monsoon rain to erode dramatically. It simply erodes more easily than harder stone, producing patterns that can mimic precipitation-caused damage. The second counter-argument concerns the climate record. Yes, North Africa was wetter during the African humid period, ending roughly 5,000 to 3,500 BCE. But some researchers argue that the drying of the Sahara was gradual and geographically varied. The Giza Plateau, specifically, may have received enough rainfall during certain periods in the early dynastic era, closer to 3,000 or 2,500 BCE, to produce some precipitation-related erosion, even without positing a pre-dynastic date. This does not require believing the mainstream dating is wrong. It simply requires believing that the climate in the Nile Valley area was somewhat wetter in 2,500 BCE than the extreme hyperaridity of today. The third counterargument is archaeological. If the Sphinx was built by a sophisticated pre-dynastic civilization, where are the other remains of that civilization? Where are their other monuments, their tools, their settlements, their burials? No archaeological layer in the Giza Plateau has been found that unambiguously predates the Old Kingdom. The tools found in association with the Sphinx excavation are consistent with Old Kingdom construction. The stratigraphy of the site does not clearly show a monument built into a much earlier context. These are serious points. They do not prove Schoch wrong, but they suggest that the rainfall erosion hypothesis, even if the erosion pattern is accurately described, does not automatically require a pre-dynastic date. Other explanations remain viable. The debate, in other words, is genuinely unresolved, not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence is ambiguous, as evidence so often is, at the edge of human knowledge. This is worth finding comforting in a way. The world is large, the past is deep, and the experts who study it most closely sometimes reach the edge of what they know and look at each other across a gap of honest uncertainty. That gap is where wonder lives. Let your breathing steady. Let your muscles release. The argument continues in the journals and at the conferences, out here, in the quiet. You don't need to resolve it tonight. Let us move from the body of the Sphinx to its face, because the face has its own mysteries. The head of the Sphinx is carved from a harder layer of limestone than the body. This is simply geological change. The bedrock at the level of the head happens to be made of stronger stone than the bedrock that forms the lower portions of the body. As a result, the head has weathered differently from the body. It is less eroded, more detailed, better preserved in its surface features. The face that we see today, that broad, serene, somewhat formal face, with its missing nose and remnant of a ceremonial beard, has been the subject of extensive analysis and a considerable debate. The mainstream argument is that the face represents Pharaoh Khafre. The comparison's often made with a diorite statue of Khafre discovered in the Valley Temple near the Sphinx, now held in the Cairo Museum. The statue is extraordinary. It shows the pharaoh seated, formal. The falcon god Horus, spreading wings behind his head, in a gesture of divine protection. The face of the statue is precise and lifelike, with high cheekbones, a slightly broad nose, and a specific set to the jaw. Some researchers see a strong resemblance between this statue and the Sphinx's face. The facial proportions, they argue, are consistent between the two. If Khafre's portrait appears both on a statue found near the Sphinx and on the Sphinx itself, that would be strong, though not conclusive, evidence that the monument was made during Khafre's reign. But others dispute the resemblance. Frank Domingo, a forensic sculptor who worked for the New York City Police Department and is expert in facial reconstruction, performed an independent analysis of the Sphinx face in the 1990s and concluded that the facial proportions of the Sphinx do not match those of the Khafre statue. He found significant differences in the nose width, the jaw shape, and the overall facial geometry. This is not a settled question. Forensic facial analysis is a challenging field, even with modern skulls and photographs. Applying it to a heavily damaged stone monument of unknown date is even more challenging. But the face raises another question beyond whose portrait it might be. Many observers, geologists, architects, and lay people alike, have noted that the head of the Sphinx seems disproportionately small compared with the body. The body is enormous, the size of a very large lion, or larger. The head, while substantial by absolute measure, seems almost too small to sit naturally atop it. This has led some researchers to propose a striking hypothesis. The head was recovered. The recarving hypothesis is one of the more quietly compelling ideas in the entire Sphinx debate. The argument goes like this. If the Sphinx is genuinely old, much older than the Old Kingdom, then it would have existed as a carved monument on the Giza Plateau for thousands of years before Khafre's reign. During that time, exposed to the elements, partially buried and unburied by sand, it would have weathered significantly. The head in particular, being exposed above the sand for much of the time, would have eroded. By the time Khafre, or whoever was responsible, encountered the monument, the original head might have been badly damaged, eroded. Perhaps it no longer looked like what it was meant to look like. A pharaoh with access to skilled craftsmen, encountering an ancient monument that had personal or religious significance, might quite logically have ordered the head recarved into his own image. This would explain the apparent mismatch in proportions. If the original head was larger, more in keeping with the massive body, and was then recarved into a smaller pharaonic form. The resulting head would be smaller than the body naturally calls for. The proportional oddity is preserved in stone. It would also explain why the head shows so much less weathering than the body. Not because the head is younger. In terms of when it was first carved, it was always part of the same monument, but because it was resurfaced. Fresh stone was exposed when the head was recut, and that fresh stone has had less time to weather than the deep surfaces of the body, which have been exposed since the original carving. Under this hypothesis, the Sphinx had a previous identity. Perhaps it was originally a lion, a full lion, head and body, carved to face the east in some prehistoric ceremony or astronomical alignment. Or perhaps it had a different human or divine form. Later Egyptians, encountering this ancient presence on their sacred plateau, claimed it by giving it the face of their king. The monument would then be simultaneously very old and partially old kingdom. Both things at once, ancient beyond the pyramids in its body and dynastic in its face. This is a hypothesis that cannot currently be proven or disproven. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive scanning technologies have been used to examine the Sphinx, and some anomalies have been detected inside and around the monument, chambers, tunnels, areas of unusual density. But these have never been fully investigated, and their nature remains unclear. For now, the recarving hypothesis lives in the space between what we know and what we can only imagine. It is the kind of idea that feels strangely right in a half-dream. The same face in a new face. The old wearing the young. The ancient wearing the name of a king. Let your mind rest on that image. An old lion, sleeping. A king's face, added later. The desert watching all of it from a polite, infinite distance. Among all the ideas surrounding the Sphinx, this one reaches furthest into the realm of the poetic and the cosmic. Some researchers have proposed that the Sphinx was oriented with specific reference to astronomical phenomena, not just to the rising sun in general, but to specific stellar or solar alignments that would have been significant at particular moments in history. The most famous version of this argument focuses on the constellation Leo. The Sphinx has the body of a lion. This is unmistakable. And in the sky, there is a constellation, Leo the lion, one of the most ancient and recognizable figures in the zodiac, known by many different names across many different cultures for thousands of years. The argument, developed by researchers including Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock in the 1990s, goes roughly like this. There is a phenomenon in astronomy called the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth wobbles slowly on its axis, like a spinning top that gradually tilts over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. As it wobbles, the sky appears to rotate slowly against the background of the seasons. The constellation that rises on the eastern horizon at the spring equinox, the so-called age of the constellation, changes over thousands of years. Today, and for the last 2,000 years or so, the spring equinox aligns with the transition from Pisces to Aquarius. Hence the idea of the age of Aquarius in popular culture. But if you roll back the astronomical clock to approximately 10,500 BCE, the spring equinox sunrise rises in the constellation of Leo, the lion. On that morning, in 10,500 BCE, a person standing at the Sphinx and looking east at the rising sun would have seen the constellation Leo rising on the horizon directly ahead of them. In the same direction the Sphinx faces, in the same form, the Sphinx embodies. The lion facing the lion in the sky. It is a haunting image, and some researchers argue it is not a coincidence. The most intriguing version of this argument suggests that the entire layout of the Giza Plateau, the three pyramids and the Sphinx, was designed to mirror a particular configuration of the sky as it appeared in approximately 10,500 BCE. The three pyramids in this view reflect the three belt stars of Orion, and the Sphinx reflects Leo. Together, the plateau maps a sky picture from a very specific ancient time. This is the kind of argument that is almost impossible to prove or disprove entirely. On one hand, humans have always found patterns in the sky, and connections between landscape and sky are common in many ancient cultures. On the other hand, given enough variables, you can find almost any alignment you want in any set of structures. What the astronomical hypothesis does, regardless of whether it is literally correct, is remind us that the builders of ancient monuments, whoever they were, often worked within a cosmological framework in which the sky and the earth were mirrors of each other. Above and below, as the ancient maxim says, a monument that faced the rising sun was not just aesthetically oriented to the east. It was participating in a cosmological conversation between the earth and the heavens. Whether or not the Sphinx was designed for 10,500 BCE, it was certainly designed with the sky in mind. The sun rises directly in front of it at the equinoxes. The face looks up as it looks east. There is a quality of attentiveness in the monument, not just watching the horizon, but watching the sky above the horizon. Imagine lying on your back in the desert outside Giza, on a clear night, watching the stars wheel overhead. The same stars the builders saw, the same Milky Way, slightly brighter, in the ancient, unpolluted sky. And the Sphinx, watching with you. That is enough. Let the stars be the last image before you drift a little further. We have arrived at the chapter where the Sphinx becomes something larger than itself. The age debate is not just a debate about one monument. It is a debate about how much of the human past we have access to, and how complete or incomplete our picture of prehistory really is. The conventional narrative of human history runs something like this. After the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago, the world's human populations gradually transitioned from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled agriculture. Agriculture led to surplus food led to population growth led to specialization and social complexity. Complexity led to cities led to writing led to recorded history. The first civilizations ran in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley in China, emerged between roughly 5,000 and 3,500 years ago. Under this narrative, anything before roughly 5,000 years ago is prehistory, a time before cities, before writing, before the kind of coordinated monumental construction that would produce something like the Sphinx. But here is the complication. Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, in what was the ancient region of Anatolia. Archaeologists have been excavating a site since the 1990s that has quietly revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric human capacity. Göbekli Tepe consists of large circular enclosures arranged in a complex pattern across a hilltop, built of enormous carved limestone pillars. The pillars are decorated with detailed relief carvings of animals: foxes, wolves, vultures, scorpions, cranes, executed with considerable artistic skill. The date of Göbekli Tepe is approximately 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, roughly 12,000 years ago. This is a monumental construction project, organized, planned, symbolically rich, built 2,000 years before the first Neolithic farming settlements in the region, and thousands of years before the first recognized civilizations. The people who built it were, by standard classifications, hunter-gatherers, and yet they organized the quarrying, transport, and erection of multi-ton stone pillars and decorated them with sophisticated imagery. Göbekli Tepe has changed the conversation about what prehistoric humans were capable of. It is not proven that there was a lost civilization in the sense of a complex urban society with writing and technology, but it has demonstrated that the capacity for monumental, organized, symbolically motivated construction is older than the civilizations we typically credit. In this context, the idea of a pre-dynastic sphinx seems less impossible. You do not need to posit a technologically advanced lost civilization to explain a very old sphinx. You only need to posit that people in the Nile Valley region, 10 or 12,000 years ago, perhaps living in a wetter, greener landscape that the climate change of the following millennia would eventually erase, possessed the organizational capacity and the symbolic motivation to carve a large figure from a natural rock outcrop. We know such people existed elsewhere. We know Göbekli Tepe was built. Whether the Giza Plateau preserves evidence of a similar prehistoric impulse is unknown, but it is no longer unthinkable. The great gift of mysteries like the Sphinx is this: they keep history humble. They remind us that the past is deeper than we thought, and that our maps of it have blank spaces, not necessarily because nothing was there, but because time and sand and weather have covered what was there. Something was always there. The desert is full of things that have not yet been found. Let us return now, from the deep past, to the plateau itself, and look at it as an organized whole. Giza is not a random collection of monuments. It is a planned landscape, or rather a landscape that accumulated planning across multiple phases, each building on and referencing what came before. The three pyramids are the most obvious element of this plan, but the plateau contains much more. There are boat pits, enormous rectangular trenches carved into the bedrock, shaped exactly like the hull of a boat, where dismantled wooden vessels were buried near the pyramids. At least one of these boat pits was excavated in the 1950s, and the wooden boat inside was found in nearly 1,200 separate pieces. It took years to reassemble. The finished vessel is approximately 143 feet long and is one of the oldest intact boats ever found. It sits today in a museum built directly over the pit where it was found. There are also multiple mortuary temples, satellite pyramids, Queen's pyramids, and workers' villages. In the 1990s, excavations led by Zahi Hawass and Mark Lahner revealed a large settlement south of the plateau that housed the workers who built the pyramids. Not slaves, as popular mythology sometimes suggests, but paid laborers, fed well enough to leave behind bones, showing signs of a reasonable diet, and even professional medical care for injuries. And there are the causeways, long, elevated processional pathways, connecting the pyramid complexes to the valley below, where the Nile flood would reach during inundation season and boats could land. These causeways connected the world of the living, by the river, to the world of the dead, on the plateau. The Sphinx sits at the base of Khafre's causeway, near the valley temple, guarding the threshold between the lower world and the higher plateau. This position, at a boundary between worlds, watching the east, is deeply significant in the context of Egyptian religious symbolism. The east is where the sun rises. The sun is where life begins each day. A monument facing east, at the boundary between the living world and the sacred plateau, was guarding not just a physical space, but a cosmological one. It was the threshold where the sun entered the world each morning. This symbolic coherence, everything fitting together into a single, unified religious landscape, is one of the strongest arguments for the Sphinx belonging to the Fourth Dynasty. It is integrated into the layout. It makes sense in that context. It is part of a system. And yet, because there is always an "and yet" with this monument, a sacred location on the Giza Plateau would have been a sacred location long before the pharaohs arrived. Elevated ground above the Nile floodplain, facing east, with a natural rock formation that invited carving. This is exactly the kind of place that humans have treated as spiritually significant across every culture and every era. A place can be sacred for 10,000 years and then be formally organized into a dynastic complex. The organization does not erase the earlier sanctity. It builds upon it. The Fourth Dynasty builders may have found something already at Giza and incorporated it, just as later peoples would incorporate what the pharaohs had built, layers upon layers. That is what the Giza Plateau is. In the end, a palimpsest, a surface written over and over, each generation leaving its marks on what the last left behind. Let the image of the plateau form in your mind. The three pyramids in the dark, the Sphinx at the base of the hill, the stars overhead. Layers of history compressed into one location, visible all at once under the desert sky. One of the things that makes studying the Sphinx so challenging is that the monument we see today is not the monument that was originally created. It has been repaired many times, by many hands, across thousands of years. The earliest repairs seem to date to the New Kingdom period, the same era as Thutmose IV and the dream Stele. Blocks of limestone were fitted around the body of the Sphinx to stabilize damaged areas. These repairs are visible today as patches of slightly different stone, slightly different texture, sometimes with the ancient tool marks still preserved on their surfaces. Later repairs came during the Greco-Roman period, when Egypt was first part of the Hellenistic world and then absorbed into the Roman Empire. More patches, more fitted blocks, more stabilization work. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Egyptology became a formal discipline, and as the Sphinx became a global icon, large-scale restoration projects were undertaken. These modern repairs are the most visible today. Sections of the lower body are covered in modern limestone blocks, fitted to replace eroded original stone. Some of these early modern repairs were actually poorly done, using hard cement that trapped moisture and accelerated erosion beneath it. More careful and scientifically informed restoration work has continued in recent decades, guided by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities and various international teams. The nose, famously, is gone. It was not removed in one dramatic event. Popular legends that attribute its destruction to Napoleon's artillery during his Egyptian campaign, 1798 to 1801, are false. Drawings made by European travelers before Napoleon's arrival already show the Sphinx without its nose. The Arabic historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 14th century CE, attributed the nose's removal to a local religious fanatic who was hanged for vandalism in response. This account may or may not be accurate, but it predates Napoleon by centuries. The ceremonial beard, the artificial beard, worn by pharaohs in formal depictions, survives only in fragments. Pieces are held in Cairo and London. Whether the beard was original or a later addition remains debated. If original, it was attached separately to the face, which may explain why it fell away. The result of all this damage and repair is that the Sphinx is a layered object in more ways than one. It is ancient stone, patched with ancient restoration, patched again with medieval intervention, patched again with modern work. Trying to study the original erosion patterns requires accounting for all of these modifications, many of which altered the very surfaces that researchers are trying to read. In a way, the Sphinx is like a very old manuscript that has been transcribed by many hands across the centuries. The original text is still there, somewhere, but it is mixed with later additions, corrections, revisions, and the occasional well-meaning error. This makes the age debate even harder to resolve than it might otherwise be. Every hand that has touched the Sphinx has added to the difficulty of reading it, and every generation that has looked at it has seen something slightly different, because they were looking at a slightly different object than the generation before. The Sphinx you see in old photographs from the 19th century is not quite the Sphinx that Thutmose IV saw. The Sphinx Thutmose IV saw is not quite the Sphinx that whoever built it first saw. We are all looking at the same thing from different angles of time. We have traveled far tonight. We have stood in the morning light before the monument. We have walked through ancient Egyptian civilization and looked at its monuments and its records. We have traced the dream Stele and the erosion debate and the face debate and the star alignments and the lost civilizations question and the geology and the repairs. And here we are, no closer to a definitive answer than we were at the beginning, which raises a real question. Why does this mystery endure? It is not simply because the evidence is incomplete. Many historical mysteries are resolved by incomplete evidence every year. Scholars make their best case from what they have, reach a consensus, and move on. Why hasn't this happened with the Sphinx? Part of the answer is that the Sphinx is too famous. It is too visible, too photographed, too iconic, to become quietly settled in the way that most historical debates eventually settle. Every new generation discovers the debate fresh. Every documentary maker, every curious traveler, every person who looks up from a textbook and thinks, but how do we really know? They all encounter the same open wound in the historical record. Part of the answer is the silence. If there were a clear inscription, if the stone itself said Khafre, made this in the 14th year of his reign, to guard the threshold of his pyramid, the debate would be over for most people. The absence of that inscription creates a space that is genuinely unsatisfying from a scientific standpoint, and that unsatisfaction is productive. It keeps people digging, asking, wondering. Part of the answer is what the mystery means emotionally. The Sphinx touches something very deep in the human imagination, a need to believe that history is larger, stranger, and more wonderful than what we have been taught. The idea that there was a forgotten civilization, a lost age, a chapter of human experience that has been erased by time and sand. This is one of the most persistent and powerful myths of modernity. We want it to be true, not because we need to undermine mainstream archaeology, but because something in us requires that the story not be finished, that there is more, always more. The Sphinx, old and silent and slightly damaged, is the perfect symbol for this need. It predates everything we know how to explain. It wears a face we cannot fully identify. It sits in a landscape full of astronomical suggestions. And it refuses, absolutely refuses, to give a simple, unambiguous answer. That refusal is not a failure. It is a quality. The most durable mysteries are not the ones that were simply lost. They are the ones whose very nature invites perpetual return. The Sphinx is a monument that produces new questions every time an old one is partially answered. It is, in this sense, the perfect companion for the space between waking and sleep. That threshold place where certainty dissolves and the mind becomes hospitable to the very large and the very old. You are in that threshold now. Let the mystery be sufficient unto itself. You do not need to solve it tonight. Before we drift into the final, quieter chapters, let us take stock. Let us stand on solid ground for a moment and say clearly what we know, what is reasonably supported, and what remains genuinely open. We can say with confidence, the Great Sphinx of Giza is a very old monument, carved from the natural limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau. It was not built from assembled blocks, but carved in place, making it a unique kind of monument, part of the earth itself. We can say with confidence that the Sphinx is associated with the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom of Ancient Egypt, roughly 2600 to 2500 BCE. The surrounding architecture, the alignment of temples, and the broader context of the Giza Plateau complex all connect the Sphinx to this period, and to the reign of Pharaoh Khafre in particular. We can say with confidence that there is no direct ancient inscription clearly attributing the Sphinx to Khafre or to any other named builder. The mainstream attribution is based on contextual evidence, not a signed document. We can say with confidence that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure are genuinely unusual, and that serious geologists have argued they show signs of precipitation-related weathering. We can also say that other serious geologists have offered alternative explanations for these patterns that do not require a pre-dynastic date. We can say with confidence that by the New Kingdom, 1400 BCE, the Sphinx was already revered as very ancient. The dream stele of Thutmose IV reflects genuine wonder at the monument's antiquity. We can say with confidence that the Sphinx has been damaged, repaired, buried, excavated, and altered many times across its history, making it a layered and complex object rather than an untouched original. What we cannot say with confidence is the precise date of the original carving. We cannot say definitively who carved it or commissioned it. We cannot say with certainty what the original face looked like, or whether it has been altered since first creation. In that band of genuine uncertainty, honest people disagree. That is science, operating as it should, slowly, carefully, with humility, at the edge of what is known. There is something deeply restful about this kind of honest uncertainty. It is better than false certainty. It is an invitation to remain curious, to continue asking, to hold knowledge lightly, and wonder more firmly. The Sphinx does not know the answer either. If a stone can be said to know anything, it simply sits there, as it has always sat, looking east, carrying the question in its wounded face. Let us allow the imagination one final, unhurried journey into the alternative. Imagine the Giza Plateau in 9000 BCE. The Sahara is not yet fully a desert. Rain still falls across this part of North Africa. Not monsoon rain, not tropical rain, but enough to keep things green. Grasslands extend across what is now barren sand. Scattered stands of acacia and wild fig grow in the wadis. Animals that no longer live in Egypt, rhinoceroses, hippopotami, elephants, wild cattle, roam the savannas to the west. The Nile is wider, more flooded, its banks thick with papyrus and lotus and birds. And on the elevated plateau, above the river, a group of people has come to this particular ridge of stone. We don't know what they call themselves. We don't know their language. We don't know what they believe. Not exactly. But they are organized. They have tools, stone tools, but sophisticated ones. They have leaders or priests or architects or some combination. They have a purpose. They have looked at this ridge of limestone and seen something in it, an animal form, a divine presence, the outline of something that was already almost there, waiting to be revealed. And they have decided to make it visible. The work takes years, perhaps decades. People come to the plateau, carve, rest, and return. The rock is hard but workable. The dust of it fills the air. The enclosure is cut, revealing walls that will eventually show the patterns of the rain that falls on them year after year, decade after decade. And from the central mass of the ridge, a form emerges. Long, low, powerful. A lion's body, a head looking east. When it is finished, or finished enough, they hold some ceremony we can't reconstruct. They stand before it in the early morning, in the moment when the sun rises directly in front of the face, flooding the plateau with gold. They have made a thing that will survive all of them. They will be forgotten. Their names will not be spoken again. Their settlements will be covered by later settlements, their tools mixed in the dirt with later tools. The land will dry. The green will recede. The desert will come, slowly and then completely. And the thing they made will remain, changing, weathering, sometimes buried, sometimes not. Later people will find it and call it something new and attach new meanings to it. A pharaoh will put his face on it. Priests will pray before it. Travelers will carve their names near it. Scientists will argue about it. But the body, the long lion's body, will persist through all of it. The oldest fingerprint of the oldest hands. If this is true, any of it, then the Sphinx is not merely a monument of ancient Egypt. It is a monument of ancient humanity. A message from people so far back in the human story that they predate everything we normally consider civilization. And that message is simply this: we were here. We looked at the world with wonder. We made something to say so. That is enough. That is more than enough. The desert at Giza is very quiet before dawn. There is a particular silence in that time, the time just before the light comes, when the stars are still overhead, but the horizon in the east has begun to shift from black to deep blue. The air is cool. The sand holds the cold of the night. The plateau is still, in the way that stone is always still. Not merely quiet, but fundamentally, prehistorically motionless. And the Great Sphinx waits. It has waited through the Old Kingdom, when the pyramids were new, and the causeways were busy with priests and workers, and boats on the Nile below. It waited through the years when Egypt was invaded by the Hyksos, from the east, and the familiar order was disrupted for the first time in centuries. It waited through the New Kingdom, when young Thutmose fell asleep in its shadow, and dreamed of divine voices. It waited through the reign of Ramesses the Great, who ruled for 66 years, and filled Egypt with his own image. It waited through the gradual decline of the pharaonic system, the centuries of invasion and conquest by Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally Romans. It waited through the rise of Christianity in Egypt, and then the rise of Islam. It waited through the medieval centuries, when its nose was damaged and its name was misremembered. It waited through Napoleon's scholars, measuring and drawing it. It waited through the 19th century's explosion of Egyptological interest, the great excavations and discoveries and debates. It waited while the 20th century changed the world beyond recognition, while 2 world wars were fought, while humans walked on the moon, while the internet emerged, and billions of people suddenly had access to its image from anywhere on Earth. And it is waiting now, tonight, as you lie here in the quiet, as your breathing slows and your body releases the weight of the day. The Sphinx is on its plateau, looking east, waiting for the sun that will come. As it always comes, we never solved it. Humanity looked at this monument for thousands of years and never fully answered its central question. Was it made by Khafre's skilled workers in 2500 BCE? Or was it made by unknown hands in 7000 or 10,000 BCE, by people whose civilization evaporated before writing existed? Or is the truth somewhere in between, an ancient form, recarved into a pharaoh's face, carrying 2 identities at once? We don't know. And somehow this feels right. Some things should remain mysterious, not out of intellectual laziness, not out of giving up on inquiry, but because the mystery itself is a kind of gift. It keeps the Sphinx alive in a way that a fully solved monument never quite is. A monument with no questions left to ask is a museum piece. A monument that still holds a secret is a living thing. The Sphinx is a living thing. It lives in the work of the geologists who study its enclosure walls. It lives in the arguments of the Egyptologists who defend the Khafre attribution. It lives in the dreams of people who imagine lost civilizations. It lives in the photographs taken by tourists, in the documentaries made by filmmakers, in the books written by researchers and dreamers and scholars. It lives in the half-formed thoughts that come to people just before sleep. Thoughts about how deep the past is, how much has been forgotten, how many mornings this particular face has watched the same sun rise. It lives here, tonight, in this quiet space between your waking and your sleeping. Let the image settle in your mind, the long body stretching low across the plateau, the forepaws extended forward, the massive head with its missing nose and its ancient expression turned to face the east, where the light will come again. You don't need to solve anything. You don't need to know who built it, or when or why. You only need to let it be what it is: old and patient and still and wonderful. Whatever the Sphinx is, However old it truly is, it has outlasted every empire that ever looked upon it. It has survived every debate, every restoration, every burial by sand, and every excavation from sand. It has worn many names and many faces of human attention, and it remains essentially what it always was: a mystery, a face in the desert, and a very long night. Let your eyes close now. Let your thoughts slow, like water finding its level. The Sphinx is watching the east, as it has always watched, waiting for the morning that will come, whether or not any of us are awake to see it. You don't have to watch it. Rest. The plateau is quiet. The stars are moving slowly overhead. The sand is still. And somewhere beneath all of this, beneath the debate and the dates and the geology and the mythology, there is simply the stone itself. Patient, ancient, holding its secret as gently as the desert holds the dark. Sleep well.